The first time I noticed the surveyor on my property, I nearly spilled my coffee. Standing at my kitchen window, I watched a woman in a high-visibility vest planting small flags along the edge of what I had always assumed was part of Oak Ridge Community's common area. It was the beginning of what would become the most bizarre property dispute of my life, one that would pit me against the most feared institution in suburban America, the Homeowners Association. My name is Derek Patterson, and 5 years ago I purchased my dream home in Lakeside Pines, a picturesque community in Naperville, Illinois. The house itself was perfect 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a spacious yard that backed up to a wooded area I thought belonged to the community. What I didn't realize at the time was that I had inadvertently purchased a front row seat to one of the most absurd power plays I would ever witness. I stepped outside, coffee mug still in hand, and approached the woman. "Excuse me," I called out. "What's going on here?" She looked up from her clipboard. "Just doing a routine survey for the HOA. They're planning some improvements to this area." "Improvements? What kind of improvements?" I asked, suddenly concerned. "A dog park, I believe," she replied casually. "The board approved it last month." This was the first I'd heard of any dog park, which was strange considering I'd attended most HOA meetings since moving in. "Are you sure this is HOA property?" My understanding was that my lot extended almost to those trees. The surveyor gave me a sympathetic look. "According to these plans, this area belongs to the community, but if you have concerns, you should bring them up with the board." That afternoon, I dug through my closing documents, searching for the property survey. When I finally found it, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The surveyor was wrong. According to my documentation, approximately 1/3 of an acre of what they were marking off belonged to me. The next day, I attended an emergency HOA board meeting I'd requested. 5 people sat behind a folding table in the community center. Our board president Barbara Wilson, treasurer Mike Hartman, secretary Cheryl Davis, and 2 other members whose names I could never remember. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Patterson," Barbara said with the forced politeness that had become her trademark. Barbara was in her early 50s with a blonde bob that never seemed to move and a penchant for pastel sweater sets. In the 3 years I'd lived there, I'd never seen her smile genuinely. "I'll get straight to the point," I said, placing my property survey on the table. "You're planning to build a dog park on my land." Barbara's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's not possible." "We've had our surveys done, and that land is common property." "With all due respect, my closing documents say otherwise," I replied, pushing the survey toward her. "This clearly shows that my property extends about 30 feet beyond where your surveyor placed those flags." Mike, a retired accountant with perpetually furrowed brows, adjusted his glasses as he examined my documents. "These look authentic, Barbara." Barbara barely glanced at the papers. "Our surveyors are professionals, Mr. Patterson. Perhaps your documents are outdated." "These are from my closing 3 years ago. Nothing has changed in the property line since then." "Well," Barbara said, folding her hands on the table, "the board has already approved the dog park project. Construction begins next week. If you have concerns, you're welcome to hire your own surveyor to verify the boundaries." "I shouldn't have to pay for another survey when I already have legal documentation," I argued. "The decision has been made," Barbara said with finality. Meeting adjourned. As I walked home, frustration boiled inside me. I should have fought harder, but I hadn't expected such immediate dismissal. When I reached my backyard, the little flags marking what would soon become a dog park seemed to mock me. The construction began exactly as promised. I watched from my deck as workers cleared the area, installed fencing, and laid down special turf designed for dogs. They added benches, water stations, and even a small obstacle course. Despite my objections, the project moved forward with startling efficiency. I consulted a lawyer who confirmed what I already knew: the land was legally mine. But he also warned me about the costs of fighting the HOA. You'd win in court, he said, but it would cost you thousands in legal fees, and the HOA would likely increase your dues to cover their own legal expenses. Plus, you'd make enemies of your neighbors. So what should I do? I asked. He shrugged. Sometimes it's better to pick your battles. The dog park isn't hurting your property value, it might even increase it. Maybe just let this one go. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow his advice. The dog park was completed within 2 weeks, and soon residents were bringing their pets to enjoy the new amenity. I had to admit, it was well designed and beautifully maintained. The HOA hired a service to clean it daily, and they installed attractive lighting that illuminated the area without shining into my windows. For the first year, I tried to ignore the fact that strangers were using my land. I even started to enjoy watching the dogs play from my kitchen window. There was something heartwarming about seeing the joy on their faces as they chased balls and socialized with other canines. During this time, I rarely interacted with the HOA board. I paid my dues on time and kept my property within their exacting standards. Barbara would occasionally nod curtly when we passed each other on the street, but that was the extent of our communication. Then came the annual HOA meeting, where Barbara proudly announced that the dog park had been such a success that they were considering expanding it. My stomach dropped. "Excuse me," I said, raising my hand. "Where exactly would this expansion take place?" Barbara's lips thinned. "We'd extend it another 20 feet toward your property line, Mr. Patterson." "But that would be even further onto my property," I objected. A murmur ran through the room. Many residents weren't aware of the property dispute. "That's simply not true," Barbara said firmly. "As we've established, that land belongs to the community." "You haven't established anything," I replied, my temper rising. "You ignored my documentation and built on my land without permission." One of my neighbors, Stephanie Zhu, turned in her seat to look at me. "Derek, if that's really your land, why did you let them build the dog park in the first place?" It was a fair question, and I didn't have a good answer. "I was trying to be a good neighbor," I said lamely. The meeting continued, but the damage was done. Some residents looked at me with suspicion, as if I was trying to claim community property as my own. Others seemed confused by the whole situation. After the meeting, Stephanie approached me. She was a real estate attorney who had moved in about a year ago. "If you don't mind me asking, have you had your own survey done recently?" "No," I admitted. "I've just been relying on the one from my closing." "You should get a new one," she advised. "Property lines can sometimes be incorrectly recorded." It would be worth knowing for sure before this escalates further. Taking her advice, I hired a professional surveyor the following week. 2 days later, he confirmed what I already knew. Approximately 0.34 acres of what was now the dog park legally belonged to me. Armed with this fresh information, I requested another meeting with the HOA board. This time, I brought Stephanie along as moral support. "As you can see from this new survey," I explained, placing the documents on the table, "a significant portion of the dog park is on my property. I've been patient, but I cannot allow you to expand further onto my land." Barbara's face hardened. "Mr. Patterson, the board has reviewed your claims thoroughly. Our legal counsel advises that since you allowed the construction without formal objection, you have effectively granted an easement to the community." "That's not how easements work," Stephanie interjected. "An easement requires formal documentation and agreement from both parties." "And who are you?" Barbara asked coldly. "Stephanie Zhu. I'm a real estate attorney and a resident of Lakeside Pines." Barbara's expression flickered briefly. Having a lawyer in the room clearly wasn't part of her plan. "Well, Miss Zhu, our counsel disagrees. The board considers this matter closed." As we left the meeting, Stephanie shook her head. "They're bluffing. You never granted any easement, formal or informal. They're hoping you'll back down again." "What should I do?" I asked. "If I were you, I'd let them finish the expansion," she said thoughtfully. "What? Why?" "Because sometimes you have to let people dig themselves deeper into trouble before you can effectively stop them. Over the next month, I watched as the HOA expanded the dog park exactly as planned, adding more play equipment and even a small shelter for owners to sit under during hot or rainy days. The construction crew seemed to work with extra enthusiasm, as if rushing to complete the project before I could intervene. Once the expansion was complete, Barbara personally supervised the installation of a new sign at the entrance. Oak Ridge Community Dog Park established 2022. It was as if she was deliberately claiming ownership. 2 years passed, and the dog park became a beloved fixture in the community. Residents regularly brought their pets, and the HOA even hosted monthly, yappy hours where people could socialize while their dogs played. I continued to pay my HOA dues and keep my property in compliance with their regulations, but I never used the dog park myself. Then came the catalyst for change. On a warm Saturday morning, I was enjoying breakfast on my deck when I overheard a conversation between Barbara and another board member as they inspected the dog park. "The Patterson situation worked out perfectly," Barbara said smugly. "He rolled over so easily. Do you know how much we saved by using his land instead of purchasing additional community property?" "Must be at least 100,000, the man replied. "Smart move." "And now he can't do anything about it," Barbara continued. "It's been operating too long. Possession is 9/10 of the law, as they say." Their laughter carried across my yard, and something inside me snapped. They hadn't just made a mistake or misinterpreted property lines, they had deliberately stolen my land to save money. I called Stephanie immediately. "I need your help," I said, explaining what I'd overheard. "That changes things," she replied gravely. "That's not just an honest mistake, it's fraud. You have options." Over coffee later that day, she outlined a plan that was both legal and deliciously satisfying. "First, we get a full professional land survey with permanent markers," she explained. "Then we record it officially with the county. After that, you're going to build a fence." "A fence," I repeated. "Yes, but not just any fence. We're going to do this completely by the book. You'll apply for all necessary permits. You'll notify the HOA in writing. You'll even offer them a chance to remove any of their property before the fence goes up. And then, one day, their dog park is going to be cut in half." The plan was set in motion. I hired the most reputable surveyor in the county, who placed permanent markers at the exact boundaries of my property. I filed the updated survey with the county recorder's office. Then, I sent a formal letter to the HOA board. "Dear board members," it read, "please be advised that I will be installing a fence on my property line as indicated by the enclosed survey. Construction will begin in 30 days. Any HOA property located on my land should be removed before that date. This is not open for discussion." The response was immediate. Barbara called an emergency board meeting and demanded my attendance. When I arrived with Stephanie, the atmosphere was tense. "Mr. Patterson," Barbara began, her voice tight with anger, "your proposed fence would cut directly through a community amenity that has been in place for years." "Yes," I agreed calmly, "because that amenity was built on my property without my permission." "We've been over this," she snapped. "The board considers this matter settled." "The county recorder's office disagrees," Stephanie interjected, sliding the official documentation across the table. "This property belongs to Derek, as it always has." "Even if that were true," Barbara argued, "you allowed the dog park to be built. You've let residents use it for years without objection. You can't suddenly change your mind." "Actually, he can," Stephanie replied. "Derek never signed any easement or agreement. He verbally objected when construction began and you ignored him. That's not how property law works." "We'll sue," Barbara threatened. I shrugged. "On what grounds? That you want to continue using land that isn't yours?" "I think a judge would be very interested to hear about how you deliberately built on my property to save money." Barbara's face paled slightly. "What are you talking about?" "I heard you, Barbara. In my backyard, bragging about how much money the HOA saved by using my land instead of purchasing additional property. That's fraud." The room fell silent. The other board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "What do you want?" Mike finally asked. "I want what's mine," I replied simply. "I'm building my fence in 30 days. You can either remove your equipment before then or it becomes mine." "This is absurd," Barbara sputtered. "The residents will be furious. They love that dog park." "Then perhaps you should have built it on community property," I suggested. As we left the meeting, Stephanie gave me an approving nod. "Well played. Now we wait." The next few weeks were uncomfortable. Neighbors I'd previously been friendly with suddenly became cold. Someone left a note in my mailbox calling me a community destroyer. Barbara apparently had been busy spreading her version of the story, but not everyone turned against me. Stephanie made sure the facts were known, sharing copies of the survey and explaining the situation to anyone who would listen. Slowly, some neighbors began to understand my position. "I'd be furious if the HOA built something on my land without permission," one of them told me at the grocery store. "Barbara has gone too far this time." The day before my fence was scheduled to go up, a petition circulated through the neighborhood calling for Barbara's resignation from the board. It cited mismanagement of community resources and deliberate misrepresentation of property boundaries. I hadn't started it, but I happily signed when it came to my door. On the morning the fence installation was set to begin, I awoke to find a small group of residents gathered at the edge of my property. My heart sank, thinking they were there to protest. But as I approached, I realized they were actually removing the dog park equipment from my land. "We thought we'd help," explained Mark, a neighbor I'd barely spoken to before. "Barbara should never have put this here in the first place." By mid-morning, all the play equipment, benches, and water stations had been relocated to the portion of the dog park that was actually on community property. It was smaller but still functional. The fence went up without incident, a handsome cedar structure that clearly marked the boundary between my property and the community space. I even installed a gate that I could open when I wanted to allow access. Barbara resigned from the board the following week, citing personal reasons. The new board president, Thomas, approached me with a formal proposal. The HOA would pay me fair market rent for the use of my land for the past 3 years, and we could negotiate a proper lease for future use if I was interested. "We want to do this right," he explained. "What Barbara did was wrong, and the board wants to make amends." I considered the offer. The back pay would be substantial, and a formal lease would ensure my property rights were protected while still allowing the community to enjoy the full dog park. "I'll think about it," I promised. That evening, as I sat on my deck looking at the newly divided dog park, I felt a mix of satisfaction and regret. I'd stood my ground and reclaimed what was rightfully mine, but the community had suffered in the process. Children were playing with their dogs in the reduced space, making the best of the situation. After much consideration, I decided to propose a compromise. I would lease part of my land to the HOA for the dog park at a nominal annual fee, with a proper contract specifying that I retained ownership. In return, I wanted one simple thing: a small plaque acknowledging that a portion of the park was generously provided by Derek Patterson. The new board eagerly accepted my terms. Within a week, we had a legally binding agreement, and I removed a section of the fence to restore the dog park to its former glory. The story of my battle with the HOA spread throughout Naperville, even making it into the local newspaper. Barbara, I heard, had moved to a condo in Chicago where there was also an HOA. I almost felt sorry for them. Life gradually returned to normal in Lakeside Pines. The dog park thrived, now with proper legal standing. Neighbors who had avoided me began to chat again, some even apologizing for misjudging the situation. One evening, about 6 months after the fence incident, I was grilling on my deck when Stephanie stopped by. "Have you seen the latest?" she asked, handing me her phone. It was a news article about Barbara Wilson, former HOA president of Lakeside Pines. She had been charged with fraud in connection with 3 other HOA communities where she had served on boards. Apparently, our situation wasn't an isolated incident. "Karma," I said, handing the phone back to Stephanie. "Justice," she corrected with a smile. "Want to come to the dog park with me? I just adopted a golden retriever." I glanced at the park, now busy with evening visitors. My plaque gleamed in the setting sun, a small but significant reminder that sometimes standing your ground is the right thing to do. "I'd like that," I replied, turning off the grill. "Let me get my jacket." As we walked toward the park, I realized how differently this could have ended. If I had given in completely, or if I had been vindictive and shut down the park entirely, neither outcome would have been satisfactory. Instead, by finding middle ground, both my property rights and the community's needs were respected. The following year brought unexpected developments. Barbara's legal troubles deepened as investigators uncovered a pattern of misconduct across multiple HOA boards. She had apparently been taking kickbacks from contractors who overcharged for community projects, including our dog park. The construction company had inflated their invoice by nearly 40%, with Barbara pocketing the difference. When the full extent of her fraud came to light, the HOA was able to recover a substantial amount of money, which they used to improve various community amenities. They even installed a proper drainage system in the dog park, something that had been cut from the original plans due to budget constraints. I became more involved in community affairs, eventually accepting a position on the HOA board myself. My experience with Barbara had shown me how easily power could be abused when residents weren't paying attention. I was determined not to let something similar happen again. My relationship with Stephanie grew closer as well. What had begun as neighborly support during my property dispute evolved into friendship and eventually something more. 2 years after the fence incident, I proposed to her in the dog park, much to the delight of our 4-legged friends and their owners. Our wedding was held in the community center, with many of our neighbors in attendance. Even Mike, the former treasurer who had been part of Barbara's board, came to offer his congratulations and apologies. "I should have questioned her more," he admitted. "I just assumed she knew what she was doing with the property boundaries." "Water under the bridge," I assured him. "We all learned something from this experience." The most surprising turn of events came 3 years after the fence incident. The neighboring community, inspired by the success of our dog park, decided to create one of their own. They approached our HOA about combining resources to create an even larger facility that would serve both neighborhoods. As the board member overseeing community properties, I was tasked with handling the negotiations. The plan called for expanding our existing park onto adjacent land that would be purchased jointly by both associations. During the planning phase, I insisted on meticulous property surveys and transparent financial arrangements. Every document was reviewed by attorneys representing both communities, and all residents were kept informed throughout the process. "You're being incredibly thorough," Thomas commented during one planning meeting. "Let's just say I've learned the importance of proper boundaries," I replied with a smile. The expanded park opened with a community celebration attended by residents from both neighborhoods. Children and dogs frolicked together while adults enjoyed a barbecue and live music. My plaque remained, now joined by a larger sign acknowledging all who had contributed to the project. As the years passed, the story of Barbara and the dog park became part of our community's folklore, often shared with new residents as a cautionary tale about the importance of vigilance and involvement. The HOA implemented new policies requiring transparent decision-making and regular financial audits, ensuring that no future board could operate with the same level of unchecked authority. I sometimes wondered what might have happened if I had immediately insisted on my property rights when the original survey was done. Perhaps a confrontation then would have spared years of quiet resentment. But I also recognized that the gradual unfolding of events had ultimately led to a stronger community and better governance. 5 years after reclaiming my property, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Barbara, written from the minimum security facility where she was serving an 18-month sentence for fraud. "Mr. Patterson," it began, "I am writing as part of my rehabilitation program, which encourages us to make amends for past wrongs. I want to apologize for deliberately encroaching on your property and for the dishonest way I handled the situation afterward. My actions were driven by a desire to appear successful as board president, regardless of the ethical compromises required. I now understand the damage my behavior caused, not only to you but to the trust of the entire community. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize the harm I caused." The letter was surprisingly sincere, lacking the defensive tone I would have expected from the Barbara I knew. I showed it to Stephanie, who had recently been elected as the new HOA president. "You think she means it?" I asked. "People can change," she replied thoughtfully. "Especially when they're forced to face consequences." I chose to believe in the possibility of redemption, writing back to acknowledge her apology and wish her well in her future endeavors. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a step toward closure. Our community continued to evolve. The dog park that had once been a symbol of conflict became a gathering place where neighbors connected and friendships formed. Children who had been toddlers when the park was built were now walking their own puppies there, unaware of the drama that had surrounded its creation. Stephanie and I eventually had children of our own, 2 energetic boys who loved playing in the park as much as the dogs did. On summer evenings, we would often bring a picnic dinner and watch the sunset from the benches Barbara had once installed to mark her territorial claim. "Daddy, did you really build this whole park?" our older son asked one evening, having overheard fragments of the story from other children. "Not exactly," I explained. "I helped make sure it was built properly with everyone's rights respected." "Like a superhero?" he asked, eyes wide. I laughed. "More like someone who learned that standing up for what's right doesn't mean you can't also be kind." It was a lesson I hoped he would carry with him, long after the details of property lines and HOA politics had faded from community memory. 10 years after the original dog park was built, Lakeside Pines was recognized as having one of the most effective and transparent homeowners associations in the state. Stephanie's leadership had transformed what had once been a source of neighborhood tension into a model of collaborative governance. Property values had increased steadily, not just because of well-maintained amenities, but because people actively wanted to live in a community where their voices mattered. Barbara, after serving her sentence, moved to Arizona and, perhaps wisely, chose a home without an HOA. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had become involved in advocacy for HOA reform, using her own story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority. As for the dog park, it continued to thrive. The small plaque acknowledging my contribution remained, though most newer residents probably didn't know the story behind it. My property line was now clearly marked with decorative landscaping rather than a fence, a gentler boundary that still served its purpose. Looking back, I realized that what had begun as a simple property dispute had ultimately transformed not just our neighborhood, but my own understanding of community. The land that Barbara had attempted to claim hadn't really been about the physical space. It had been about respect, fairness, and the delicate balance between individual rights and collective well-being. On the 10th anniversary of the park's opening, the HOA hosted a celebration complete with a professional dog photographer, contests, and treats for both humans and canines. Standing amidst the joyful chaos, I couldn't help but marvel at how differently things had turned out from what I had initially feared. "Penny, for your thoughts," Stephanie said, joining me with our youngest son in her arms. "Just thinking about how sometimes the worst situations can lead to the best outcomes," I replied, watching our older boy throw a ball for a neighbor's enthusiastic Labrador. "You know," she said, "if Barbara hadn't built that dog park on your property, we might never have gotten to know each other." I smiled, putting my arm around her shoulders. "Then I guess I owe her a thank you after all." As the sun set on another day in Lakeside Pines, dogs played, children laughed, and neighbors chatted on benches that straddled what had once been a contentious boundary. The property line still existed on paper, but in reality, it had become something more meaningful. A reminder that with patience, integrity, and a willingness to compromise, even the deepest conflicts could be transformed into foundations for something better. My property deed still showed that 0.34 acres of the dog park sat on land that legally belonged to me. But in a more important sense, it belonged to all of us not because anyone had claimed it improperly, but because we had chosen to share it properly. And that, I realized, was the difference that mattered most.